Hey everybody, this is the stuff at the beginning and the introduction to Max Horkheimer and the Foundations of the Frankfurt School by John Abromeit. Table of contents, introduction with the headings, why a new study of Horkheimer and early critical theory, Horkheimer's Eclipse and the Anglo-American reception of critical theory, the relevance of Horkheimer's early critical theory to contemporary discussions, overview of the book's structure and content. Chapter 1, Coming of Age in Wilhelmine, Germany, Childhood and Youth, The War Years, Horkheimer's Brief Stay in Bohemia, Munich, 1918 to 1919. Between Contempt and Compassion, Horkheimer's Early Intellectual Development. Chapter 2, Student Years in Frankfurt, Biographical Developments in the 1920s, Horkheimer's Academic Studies, the theoretical lessons Horkheimer learned from his academic studies. Chapter 3, A Materialist Interpretation of the History of Modern Philosophy, with the headings, Horkheimer's Break with Consciousness Philosophy and his Turn towards History and Society, Horkheimer's Materialist Interpretation of the History of Modern Philosophy, the Early Modern Period, German Idealism, the Emancipation of Philosophy from Science, the Development of Bourgeois Philosophy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Chapter 4, The Beginnings of a Critical Theory of Contemporary Society, with the headings, Neither, quote, free-floating, and, quote, Horkheimer's Critique of Karl Mannheim's Sociology of Knowledge, nor, quote, firmly rooted, end quote. Horkheimer's Critique of Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism. The Twilight of Bourgeois Society, Dämmerung, the place of Dämmerung in Horkheimer's thought, Dämmerung as an expression of Horkheimer's nascent critical theory. Horkheimer's and Pollack's understanding of the Soviet Union in the late 1920s. Chapter 5, Horkheimer's integration of psychoanalysis into his theory of contemporary society. With the headings, The Biographical and Historical Context, the theoretical place of psychoanalysis in Horkheimer's thought in the late 1920s. Horkheimer, From Gestalt Psychology to Psychoanalysis, Demystifying the Unconscious, Theodor Adorno's first Habilitationsschrift. The beginnings of Fromm's analytic social psychology and his theoretical elective affinity with Horkheimer. The empirical study of German workers in 1929 is the first attempt to put Horkheimer's theory of contemporary society into practice. Chapter 6, Horkheimer's concept of materialism in the early 1930s. Horkheimer's philosophical determination of materialism, materialism in metaphysics, materialism in morality. The Institute's research project on the history of materialism. Chapter 7, The Anthropology of the Bourgeois Epoch, with the headings, Methodological and Theoretical Underpinnings, quote, Egoism and Freedom Movements, end quote. The Historical Foundations of Bourgeois Anthropology, The Studies on Authority and Family and the Contemporary State of Bourgeois Anthropology. Chapter 8, Reflections on Dialectical Logic in the Mid-1930s, the Critique of Cartesian Empirical Consciousness Philosophy, Science and Metaphysics, the Antinomies of Philosophy in the Bourgeois Epoch, Hegel and the Beginnings of Dialectical Logic, Horkheimer's Reformulation of Marx's Critical Theory. Excursus 1, The Theoretical Foundations of Horkheimer's Split with Erich Fromm in the late 1930s, Fromm's Critique of Freud's Drive Theory. Excursus 2, Divergence, Estrangement, and Gradual Rapprochement, The Evolution of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno's Theoretical Relationship in the 1930s, with the headings Divergence and Estrangement, Rapprochement, Adorno's Shift Away from Benjamin, Adorno's, quote, renewed and fruitful study of Hegel, end quote, Adorno's positive reception of Horkheimer's essays in the mid-1930s, Persistent differences between Horkheimer and Adorno. Chapter 9, State Capitalism, the End of Horkheimer's Early Critical Theory, with the headings, quote, Montaigne and the Function of Skepticism, end quote, the beginning of the end of Horkheimer's early critical theory. The Transitional Period, the Jews in Europe and Authoritarian State. the article End of Reason as the end of Horkheimer's critical theory. Epilogue, towards a historization of dialectic of enlightenment and a reconsideration of Horkheimer's early critical theory. Acknowledgements. This project has been a long time in the making. I have incurred many debts along the way. I would like to thank first the organizations that had given me financial assistance, especially the German Academic Exchange Service and the Department of History at the University of California, Berkeley, which both provided me with generous research and writing grants. I have benefited in less tangible but certainly no less valuable ways from 5 different intellectual communities in which I have had the privilege and pleasure to participate since the early 90s. I first encountered critical theory as an undergraduate at Stanford University in the stimulating seminars of Russell Berman. Barry Katz first made me aware of the critical theory archives in Frankfurt and provided excellent guidance for my undergraduate honors thesis on Marcuse and Heidegger. During my first extended stay in Frankfurt from 1993 to 1995, I encountered critical theory as a living tradition in the lectures of Jürgen Habermas and the seminars of Alfred Schmidt. I would like to thank Professor Schmidt in particular for drawing my attention to the centrality of philosophical materialism to the critical theoretical tradition from Horkheimer's early essays to Adorno's late Magna Opera. To my delight, I discovered that the tradition of critical theory was also still very much alive outside the academy in Frankfurt. I owe a particular debt to the members of the International Political Quarterly Perspektiven, whose impressive work in the mid-1990s demonstrated that critical theory could still illuminate political conflicts around the world and in some cases even suggest ways to productively intervene. I would like to thank the co-founders of the newspaper, Michael Wertz, Helga Flores Trejo, as well as the other members of the editorial board, including Bagar Afshani, Harry Bauer, Jochen Freiberg, Saeed Husseini, Sven Jan, Thomas Kimmig, Heike Litzinger, Christian Meidert, Raphael Mravzinski, Jana Müller-Gerber, Achim Seifert, and most of all, Nenad Stefanov, not just for all their engaging discussions, but also for making me feel so at home in Frankfurt. I'm also grateful to Stefan Bunzhuch. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Bunzhuch, whom I first met in the Herbert Marcuse archives in 1992, and whose high intellectual and political standards have always impressed me for his generosity and friendship over the years. When I returned to Frankfurt in 1999, Matthias Lutz Bachmann and Axel Honneth kindly invited me to participate in their graduate philosophy colloquia. I would like to thank both of them for this opportunity and also for the helpful advice and support they gave me in my project. Detlef Clausen provided me with many valuable insights into critical theory as well as much appreciated opportunity to teach and participate in the discussions in the sociology department at the University of Hanover. I am grateful to Helmut Reinecke and Annette Oma for inviting me to present some of my early research at the University of Flensburg, and also for hosting a workshop for our Frankfurt Marx reading group. Other friends and colleagues in Frankfurt who provided valuable intellectual and/or personal support include Odetta Barbosa, Alex Demirovich, Torsten Fott, Grema Gillach, Iris Harnischmacher, Katharina Hartmann, Peter Erwin Janssen, Yeho Kong, Andreas Niederberger, Soraya Nur, Jose Manuel Romero, Olivier Voral, and Erzin Yildiz. I owe a special thanks to the successive directors of the Max Horkheimer Archive in Frankfurt. Although Gunselin Schmidt-Nuhr was just completing his tenure as director when I began working in the archive, my research was facilitated greatly by the remarkable care and conscientiousness with which he carried out his duties as the principal editor of the 19-volume Gazamelta-Schriften edition of Horkheimer's writings. I am, as all future scholars of Horkheimer will be, in his debt for this exemplary work. The next two directors of the Horkheimer archive, Johann Stolberg and Stefan Roper, both donated their time and expertise generously to me at various stages in the project. During my graduate studies at UC Berkeley, I benefited greatly from the lively intellectual life in the history department and throughout the campus as a whole. I owe a tremendous debt to my dissertation advisor, Martin J., who has generously provided me with extremely valued support and guidance throughout the entire course of this project. It has been a true privilege to work with the historian who has done more than anyone to introduce and establish the tradition of critical theory in the English-speaking world. I also thank Martin J. for introducing me to Samir Gandesha in Berkeley in 1997. It didn't take long for me to realize that Samir is not just an outstanding Adorno scholar, but also an accomplished practitioner of the difficult art of negative dialectics. I have benefited immensely from his careful reading of and astute comments on the manuscripts from the earliest stages to the very end. Other friends and colleagues in the Bay Area who provided me with valuable intellectual and/or personal support include Rakesh Bhandari, Matt Erlin, Tina Gerhardt, David Hollinger, Robert Holub, Donna Jones, Ben Lazier, Sam Moyne, Donna Murch, Scott Murtashaw, Noah Schusterman, Ania Wertz, and of course, Ronald Wright. During my 4 years of postdoctoral work at the University of Chicago, when I transformed my dissertation into a book, I was privileged to participate in two different groups of impressive scholars, the Society of Fellows and the Social Theory Workshop. I benefited greatly from my affiliation with both. I owe a particular debt to Moishe Pistone, in whose thought and writing the best traditions of critical theory are alive and well, for his intellectual example and his comments on the chapters I presented in the Social Theory Workshop. I'd also like to thank William Sewell and Gary Harrigal for many stimulating and challenging discussions. I owe much to Richard Westerman, whose impressive knowledge of Kierkegaard, Husserl, and Lukács was a great help as we worked through Adorno's early writings together. I would also like to thank the following friends and colleagues from Chicago: Janet Afari, Kevin Anderson, Jason Dalsey, Parker Everett, Joe Feinberg, Deborah Gould, Chris Hayden, David Ingram, Reha Kadakel, Lauren Langman, Mark Loeffler, Pierre-Francois Nopin, Danny Postel, Andrew Sartori, and Joe Sexauer. Since moving to Buffalo in January 2009, I have become part of another lively intellectual community. I would like to thank my colleagues in the History and Social Studies Education Department at SUNY Buffalo State for welcoming me so warmly and for allowing me to delay my appointment one semester in order to finish this book. I'd like to extend a special thanks to the chair of our department, David Carson, for his support, and also to my colleagues, Gary Marotta and York Norman, for their intellectual camaraderie. Georg Iggers, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Buffalo, has generously shared his knowledge and time with me. Becoming better acquainted with him and his wife, Wilma Iggers, and learning more about their impressive scholarly and political work as well as their remarkable lives have been a real inspiration for me. In addition to the aforementioned communities of scholars and intellectuals in which I have had the good fortune to participate, there are a number of other individuals I would like to thank. Few people know the entire Frankfurt School tradition as well as Marcos Noble, and I have learned much from the many conversations I have had with him over the past decade. I would also like to thank him and his colleagues, especially Ricardo Terra and Jose Rodriguez, for introducing me to the remarkable group of scholars working in Sao Paulo on the Frankfurt School and for giving me the opportunity to present my work there on two separate occasions. I thank Mark Cobb for inviting me to give a talk on Horkheimer at Pensacola State College and for all the stimulating discussions we have had on critical theory, philosophy, and progressive politics since we organized the Herbert Marcuse Conference together in 1998. Richard Wolin, whom I first met at the Berkeley Marcuse Conference, has read and provided helpful comments on several of the chapters. I would like to thank him, Jared Siegel, and many other members of the New York City area intellectual historians group for giving me an opportunity to present my work there. I'm indebted to Thomas Wheatland for sharing his insider's knowledge of the academic publishing world and giving me valuable advice about how to navigate within it. I have always looked forward to and benefited from the discussions I have had over the past 15 years with Lars Rensman, whose profound knowledge of the traurige Wissenschaft of critical theory has thankfully not yet led him into the clutches of l'esprit de sérieux. I have no idea what that means. I'm grateful to Stefano Giacetti for the invitation to present my work at one of the remarkable conferences on critical theory he has organized in Rome over the past decade. Others who have read and provided helpful comments on various chapters include Vance Bell, Gad Horowitz, Paul Robinson, and Joel Whitebook. Joel Whitebook wrote an intellectual biography of Freud, which I'd like to read. Finally, I would like to thank the individuals who have made the actual production of this book possible. I am grateful in particular to my editor at Cambridge University Press, Eric Crahan, and the head of the production team at Nugan Publishing, Rajashri Ravindranathan, for their patience and professionalism. I am also very grateful to David Ingram, John McCole, and Kevin Anderson for their careful reading of the manuscript and the many helpful comments they provide. I'd like to dedicate this book with gratitude to the members of my immediate family, my parents Shannon and Dwayne Abromeit, my grandmother Betty Abromeit, my sister Erin Boss, and my partner Deirdre Bishop. Without their ongoing encouragement and support, this project and most of the other good things in my life would not have been possible. Okay. New section, a note on references and permissions. Throughout the footnotes, GS refers to the 19-volume collected writings edition of Horkheimer's works, the Max Horkheimer Gesammelte Schriften, edited by Alfred Schmidt and Gunzellen Schmid-Nur. MHA refers to the Max Horkheimer archive in the Stadt- and Universität Bibliothek. I don't know if I need to read all this, actually. Okay, so introduction. To judge something that has substance and solid worth is quite easy. To comprehend it is much harder. Producing an adequate representation of it, which unifies judgment and comprehension, is the most difficult of all. End quote. Hegel, Preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. New section. Why a new study of Horkheimer and early critical theory? This study has two main purposes which overlap but are not identical. First is intended as a comprehensive intellectual biography of Max Horkheimer from 1895, when he was born, to 1941, which marks the threshold of a new phase in Horkheimer's life and thought. Footnote. 1941 marks a logical place to end a study on the early and middle phases of his intellectual biography for several reasons. In that year, Horkheimer reduced to a bare minimum the activities of the New York branch of the Institute for Social Research and discontinued the publication of the Institute's journal, so he could move to Los Angeles, where he could dedicate himself to his theoretical work unencumbered by any practical or administrative responsibilities. 1941 also marks the culmination of a rather dramatic shift in Horkheimer's thought. The beginnings of this shift are best symbolized by Theodor Adorno's arrival in New York and his appointment as a full member of the Institute in 1938 on the one hand, and the departure of Erich Fromm from the Institute the following year on the other. Although not the only factor in the transformation of Horkheimer's thought during this time, his closer working relationship with Adorno in the period 1938 to 41 did much to push Horkheimer away from some of the key theoretical positions he had developed in the early and mid-1930s. For a more detailed examination of this shift, see Excursuses 1 and 2 and Chapter 9. End footnote. Several excellent general studies of the development of critical theory as a whole have been written. Footnote. Although the concept of critical theory is normally much more diffuse in the Anglo-American world, I shall follow the German convention here by using it to refer specifically to Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School tradition. In order to distinguish my use of the term in the specific way, I will capitalize it throughout. And footnote. Footnote. Most notably, Martin Jay's Dialectical Imagination, A History of the Frankfurt School in the Institute of Social Research, 1923 to 1950, published in 1973. Rolf Wiggerhaus's book, The Frankfurt School, Its History, Theories, and Political Significance. See also David Held's Introduction to Critical Theory, Horkheimer to Habermas, published in 1980. And Douglas Kellner's book, Critical Theory, Marxism, and Modernity, published in 1989. Okay. And footnote. However, the publication of Horkheimer's collected writings and the opening of the Max Horkheimer archives have made available much previously unknown or unavailable material, which has made a reassessment of Adorno's work possible. The study draws on this material as well as the extensive secondary literature on Horkheimer in German and the much less extensive literature in English. In general, the focus is directed primarily and unapologetically to Horkheimer's thought. Examination of the biographical details of Horkheimer's life or the lives of those who influenced him is in most cases limited to what is necessary to explain the development of his ideas. In the first two chapters, which treats Horkheimer's childhood, youth, and student years, more attention is devoted to biographical context. Beginning with third chapter, Horkheimer's theoretical work and those writings of his colleagues which contribute to an understanding of his own writings become the central concern. Although I have sought to refer to and build on earlier scholarship rather than repeat it, some repetition has been unavoidable in order to present a coherent narrative. To be sure, I have drawn on previous general treatments of the history of critical theory, such as Martin Jay's still unsurpassed dialectical imagination and Rolf Wiggerhaus's The Frankfurt School, but I have also sought to revise and deepen their accounts when necessary. In addition, the principal and subsidiary arguments presented here have been developed in dialogue with a number of other authors who have written studies that either focus primarily on Horkheimer or present particularly incisive or influential interpretations of his work. Footnote. Among the former group of authors, I have engaged most with the following studies: Helmut Dubiel's book, Theory and Politics, Studies in the Development of Critical Theory, translated by Benjamin Gregg in 1985. Gerd Walter Küster's Der Kritikbegriff in der kritischen Theorie Max Horkheimers, published in 1980. Peter Sturck's book, Max Horkheimer, A New Interpretation. Olaf Asbach, Von der Erkenntnistheorie der kritischen Theorie des Gesellschaft, eine Untersuchung zur Vor- und Entstehungsgeschichte der kritischen Theorie Max Horkheimers, 1920 to 1927, and Kritische Gesellschaftstheorie und historische Praxis, Entwicklungen der kritischen Theorie by Max Horkheimer, 1930 to 1942/43. Among the latter group of authors, I have engaged most with the following: Alfred Schmidt, Jürgen Habermas, Axel Honneth, Gunselin Schmid-Nur, Moishe Pistone, Hauke Brunkhorst. For references to their numerous works on Horkheimer, please consult the bibliography on the various discussions of them, or the various discussions of them in the main text. And footnote. The second main purpose of this study is to recover and reconstruct the model of, quote, early critical theory that largely coincides but is not identical with Horkheimer's own thought from the late 1920s to the mid-1930s. I have chosen to focus on Horkheimer's early critical theory here for a number of reasons. As will become apparent in the remaining pages of this introduction, I believe that Horkheimer's early work was not only his best, but also that which has the potential to contribute most to contemporary discussions and attempts to renew critical theory. Horkheimer's early critical theory is much less familiar today than Dialectic of Enlightenment or even Eclipse of Reason. Horkheimer's commitment to the 1930s commitment in the 1930s to expressing himself primarily in essays and aphorisms rather than books has contributed to the neglect of his early writings. Yet taken together, the essays and aphorisms Horkheimer wrote during this time constitute a very substantial body of work that is eminently worthy of reconsideration. Of these essays, only Horkheimer's 1931 inaugural address as the new director of the Institute for Social Research, titled The Present Situation of Social Philosophy and the Tasks of an Institute for Social Research, and his 1937 programmatic essay, titled Traditional and Critical Theory, remain somewhat familiar today. However, this focus on what are interpreted as Horkheimer's, quote, methodological essays from the 1930s has contributed to a misleading view of the overall aims and accomplishments of Adorno's early critical theory. The systematic interpretation and overview presented here of Horkheimer's work in the 1920s and 1930s will enable these aims and accomplishments to merge more clearly and hopefully will also spark a renewed engagement with this remarkable body of work. Recovering the model of early critical theory also requires a re-examination of Horkheimer's personal and, more importantly, theoretical relationships with Erich Fromm and Theodor Adorno in the late 1920s and 1930s. The acrimonious debates that marked Fromm's departure from the Institute in 1939 and continued with other members of the Institute, most notably Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, have obscured the important contributions Fromm made to the formation of early critical theory. So significant attention will be paid here to Fromm's own intellectual development and the strong affinities between his and Horkheimer's work during this time. Because Horkheimer is often remembered today primarily as the co-author with Adorno of Dialectic of Enlightenment, I will also devote much attention here to working out the important theoretical differences that existed between Horkheimer and Adorno from the late 1920s through the late 1930s. When Horkheimer and Adorno met in the mid-1920s, they had many common interests and even a shared academic advisor in Hans Cornelius. So why did the two of them part ways theoretically in the late 1920s, and why did these differences persist through the 1930s? In order to fully grasp the distinctiveness of the model of early critical theory, and in particular the important ways in which it differs from Dialectic of Enlightenment, it is necessary to reconstruct Horkheimer's shifting attitude toward Adorno's theoretical writings in the 1920s and 1930s. To further elaborate the main aims of this study, it would be helpful to say a few words about the title and the concept of, quote, foundations in particular. On the one hand, the foundations of Horkheimer's early critical theory thus were anti-foundational. On the one hand, the foundations of Horkheimer's critical theory were anti-foundational, insofar as they were thoroughly historical and not ontological or metaphysical. On the other hand, it was essential to Horkheimer to recognize that all of the theoretical concepts Horkheimer developed were related in more or less mediated ways to the historical epoch in which he was living, what he called the, quote, bourgeois epoch, unquote. Perhaps the most important way in which critical theory differed from its, quote, traditional counterparts was its refusal to naturalize modern bourgeois capitalist society and its attempt to identify the contradictions and tendencies that could possibly, if by no means necessarily, lead to a qualitatively new post-capitalist and post-bourgeois historical epoch. This presupposition of a historically discrete but still incomplete bourgeois epoch forms the basis of Horkheimer's work through the late 1930s. However, one can and must speak of the historical foundation of Horkheimer's early critical theory in a more precise sense, for it is the historical transformation and antagonistic dynamic of modern bourgeois society, or in other words, the dialectic of bourgeois society, that structured his thought at the most general level during this time. The meaning of this concept will become fully apparent in the further course of this study, but a preliminary determination of it can be found in Horkheimer's 1937 essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, which is on this channel. Quote, to put it in broad terms, the theory says that the basic form of the historically given commodity economy on which modern history rests contains in itself the internal and external contradictions of the modern era. It generates these contradictions over and over again in an increasingly heightened form, and after a period of progress, development of human powers and emancipation of the individual, after an enormous extension of human control over nature, it finally hinders further development and drives humanity into a new barbarism, end quote. Traditional and Critical Theory. This dialectic first moved to the center of Horkheimer's work in his lectures on the history of philosophy in the late 1920s. There and in many other essays he wrote in the 1930s, the concept was formulated in less economistic terms than in the previously quoted passage. As we shall see, the philosophical dimension of the dialectic of bourgeois society were crucial for Horkheimer. He took very serious the critical philosophical ideals that were articulated during the ascent of the European bourgeoisie during the early modern period, but he also came to believe that these ideals were increasingly hollowed out with the consolidation of capitalism and the gradual transformation of the bourgeoisie from an oppositional to a hegemonic social formation in the 18th and 19th centuries. The title of this study also implies that the tradition of, quote, Frankfurt School critical theory has its foundations in Horkheimer's early work. This implication is intended, but it must be qualified in certain ways. The, quote, Frankfurt School label is useful to designate a general way of a tradition of critical social theory that has certain important continuities, but the label is problematic insofar as it obscures the qualitative shifts and transformations this tradition has undergone. Although there is little question that the, quote, Frankfurt School tradition first took shape in Horkheimer's early writings, the book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, represents a qualitatively different model that fits seamlessly into the larger trajectory of Adorno's work, but represents a break with Horkheimer's early critical theory. Habermas's early work, especially his book Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, bears strong affinities to the model of early critical theory in general, and to the idea of a dialectic of bourgeois society in particular. Yet in the following years, Habermas would develop a theory of communicative action that, despite his continuing gestures to the relevance of Horkheimer's early work, represented another qualitatively new paradigm within Frankfurt School critical theory. My intention here is not to uphold Horkheimer's early work as a rigid orthodoxy that disavows or precludes any further innovations in the tradition. Such dogmatic foundationalism would be antithetical to the fundamental openness of Horkheimer's early critical theory, according to which theoretical concepts must be constantly revised in light of new historical and empirical social research. I do not believe, however, that Horkheimer's early work represents a distinct model that has been unjustly forgotten. I do believe, however, that Horkheimer's early work represents a distinct model that has been unjustly forgotten and could still contribute much to current attempts to develop a critical theory adequate to early 21st century social and political conditions. New section, Horkheimer's Eclipse in the Anglo-American reception of critical theory. In the remainder of this introduction, and in the epilogue, I'll put forth my case for revisiting the model of early critical theory developed by Horkheimer and Fromm. First, however, let us examine the reasons why Horkheimer's work has fared so poorly in the reception of critical theory in the Anglo-American world compared to that of the other members of the Frankfurt School tradition. One important cause of the eclipse of Horkheimer's work can be found already in his response to the changed political historical conditions in Europe and the United States after World War II. After 17 years in exile in the United States, Horkheimer returned to Frankfurt in 1950 to rebuild the Institute for Social Research and to play a role in the education of the first generation of German students after the catastrophic events of the war and the civilizational rupture of Auschwitz. Habermas's well-known anecdote that Horkheimer kept his writings from the 1930s under lock and key in the basement of the rebuilt Institute for Social Research is symptomatic of the dramatic shift in his thought that occurred after his return to Germany. Horkheimer became rector of the G.W. Goethe University in Frankfurt and was on friendly terms with many of the most important German and American figures in the post-war reconstruction of the Federal Republic, including Theodor Heuss and John J. McCloy. Horkheimer's theoretical production came to a virtual halt, and his public political pronouncements became increasingly conservative in the 1950s and 1960s. When his writings from the 1930s began to circulate once again in pirate editions during the tumultuous political climate of the 1960s, Horkheimer was reluctant to republish them. He finally did so only after distancing himself from them and arguing that the qualitatively different historical and political situation defied any unmediated application of his earlier work to present conditions. Horkheimer had, in other words, done much himself in the 1950s and 1960s to create the impression that his earlier work was no longer relevant to contemporary concerns. Anyone who takes seriously the, quote, temporal core... What the hell? Sorry, something just went fucking crazy with my computer. Okay. Sorry about that. Anyone who takes seriously the, quote, temporal core of truth, end quote, which was an essential characteristic of his critical theory throughout his life, is obligated to heed his warnings about appropriating his theoretical concepts in an ahistorical fashion. Yet, one must also recognize that social, political, and historical conditions have changed dramatically since the 1960s. If one rejects the static positivist view of history as Horkheimer did, and recognizes that any interpretation of historical events contains an essential subjective moment, and that changed conditions in the present create new possibilities for interpreting and appropriating the past, then one need not view Horkheimer's warnings in the 1960s about the dated character of his earlier work as an absolute prohibition. In Germany, Horkheimer and Adorno had already been prominent figures in scholarly and broader public discussions in the 1950s and early 1960s. Even though the New Left and protest movement were important in the late 1960s in drawing further attention to their work. Footnote: Horkheimer became head of the philosophy department and then rector of the J.W. Goethe University as a whole in the early 1950s. Although Horkheimer played a crucial role in rebuilding the Institute for Social Research after the war and gave frequent public speeches and radio addresses, Horkheimer's intellectual production was limited, particularly compared to that of Adorno, who really found an audience for the first time in the Federal Republic in the 1950s and 1960s. On Horkheimer and Adorno's roles as public intellectuals in the post-war period, see Detlef Clausen's and Stefan Müller-Düm's books. End footnote. With the exception of the reception of the Institute's Studies in Prejudice among American sociologists, critical theory remained relatively unknown in the United States prior to Herbert Marcuse's appearance in public debates in the late 1960s. Footnote: the best examination of the American reception of the work of Horkheimer and the other members of the Institute is Thomas Wheatland's recent study, The Frankfurt School in Exile, published in 2009. Wheatland demonstrates that a few members of the New York intellectual community did take a serious interest in Horkheimer and his colleagues in the 1930s and 1940s. He also describes the positive reception among American sociologists not only of the Studies in Prejudice, but also the Institute's earlier empirical project, the Studies on Authority and Family. Yet he also points out that his early reception was much more limited than it could have been, and that the Americans' reception of the Institute's empirical work failed fully to grasp the theoretical principles that had guided them. Thus, overall, his study confirms that a serious and comprehensive American reception of their work did not begin until the 1970s. For a more detailed discussion of Wheatland's studies, see my review titled Reconsidering the History of the Frankfurt School in America, published in Reviews in American History, Volume 39, Number 2, June 2011. End footnote. However, Marcuse's sudden rise to prominence proved to be a mixed blessing for the American reception of critical theory in the following decades. Footnote: for an overview of the Anglo-American reception of Marcuse, see Herbert Marcuse, A Critical Reader, edited by John Abromeit and W. Mark Cobb, in 2004, as well as a piece by W. Mark Cobb in the same volume titled Diatribes and Distortions, Marcuse's Academic Reception. End footnote. As one commentator put it, quote, unwanted media celebrity first, quote, gurufied, end quote, Marcuse, ... then stamped his thoughts with the killing censorship of a fad whose time had passed, end quote. And that quote's from Mike Davis in City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles. End footnote. Martin Jay's pioneering study of the history of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research, along with several other monographs, translations, edited anthologies, and journal articles in the 1970s on critical theory and or particular critical theorists, left no doubt that their work deserves more serious attention. Footnote. See Martin J. Dialectical Imagination and Susan Buck-Morss's The Origin of Negative Dialectics, Theodore W. Adorno, Walter Benjamin, and the Frankfurt Institute, published in 1977. Anthologies include The Essential Frankfurt School Reader, edited by Andrew Arato and Eike Gefhardt in 1978. Translations include Max Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment, translated by John Cumming, and Max Horkheimer, Critical Theory, the journals that played the important role in introducing critical theory to an American audience in the 1970s were Telos and New German Critique. End footnote. Yet the academic reception of critical theory in the United States remained uneven at best. Despite several first-rate studies of his life and work, Marcuse's theoretical and philosophical work had been largely forgotten by the mid-1980s. Footnote. See Martin Schulman's book, The Imaginary Witness, The Critical Theory of Herbert Marcuse, published in 1980, and Barry Katz's book, Herbert Marcuse and the Art of Liberation, published in 1982, and Douglas Kellner's book, Herbert Marcuse and the Crisis of Marxism, published in 1984. End footnote. A selection of some of Horkheimer's most important essays from the 1930s appeared in English translation in 1972. The first and only monograph dedicated to Horkheimer appeared in 1992, but it was written by a young British scholar and went largely unnoticed in the United States. Footnote. See Peter Sturck's book, Max Horkheimer, A New Interpretation, published in 1992. End footnote. The next significant collection of Horkheimer's essays in English translation did not appear until 1993. Footnote. See Max Horkheimer, Between Philosophy and Social Science, Selected Early Essays, translated by G. Frederick Hunter, Matthew S. Kramer, and John Torpy, published in 1993. End footnote. By this time, however, the intellectual field had shifted decisively. French, quote, post-structuralist theory had become a dominant force in the Anglo-American Academy. Footnote, quote, post-structuralism was the term coined in the United States that referred in a very imprecise way to the diverse bodies of work of theorists such as Lyotard, Foucault, and Derrida. None of these theorists accepted the leveling of the differences between their work that the concept arguably implied. End footnote. With their thoroughgoing skepticism of, quote, grand narratives, end quote, of progress in history and science and their effort to reorient critical theory toward the concrete particular, Adorno and Benjamin's work resonated in some, if certainly not all, ways with the, quote, postmodernism and or, quote, post-structuralism of Lyotard, Derrida, and Foucault. Footnote. See, for example, Lyotard's essay, Adorno as the Devil, published in Telos in 1974, Derrida's appreciative discussion of Benjamin's controversial discussion of law and violence in the article Force of Law, the Mystical Foundation of Authority, translated by Mary Quaintance in the book Acts of Religion, edited by Jill Anijar, In Derrida's discussion of Adorno and Benjamin in the speech he gave upon accepting the Theodor Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt in 2001, titled, quote, Ficus, in Jacques Derrida Paper Machine, translated by Rachel Bowlby in 2005. In a late interview, Foucault also emphasized the commonalities that existed between his own work and that of the Frankfurt School. See Critique and Power, Recasting the Foucault-Habermas Debate, edited by Michael Kelly in 1994. End footnote. Furthermore, because Adorno and Benjamin had devoted more attention to aesthetics and cultural theory than Horkheimer, their work was still of interest in language and literature departments, as well as interdisciplinary humanities and cultural studies programs, in which postmodern and post-structuralist theory established itself most successfully. Jürgen Habermas also established himself in the American Academy in the 1980s, but in different fields, in philosophy and to a lesser extent sociology and political science departments. Footnote: see Habermas's first work, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, an inquiry into a category of bourgeois society, which was originally published in 1962, but did not appear in English translation until 1989, stimulated much discussion among historians in the United States as the following collections of essay make clear. Habermas and the Public Sphere, edited by Craig Calhoun in 1992. See Habermas's move away in the mid-1960s from an understanding of modern European history as a, quote, dialectic of bourgeois society, end quote, which was indebted to Horkheimer's early critical theory, toward a more systematic and normative understanding of, quote, modernity as the differentiation of value spheres. His work has not resonated as much with historians. For a perceptive examination in this crucial shift in Habermas's theory of history, see John McCormick's book, Weber, Habermas and the Transformation of the European State, Constitutional, Social, and Supranational Democracy, published in 2007. End footnote. At least through the mid-1980s, Habermas continued to present his own work as a critical reformulation of the theoretical project developed at the Institute for Social Research in the 1930s. Yet since Habermas became increasingly focused on questions of liberal democratic political philosophy and legal theory in the late 1980s and 1990s, few people doubt any longer that his work represented a profound break with the critical theory of Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse. This break was illustrated by Habermas's reception in the United States, which, like his reception in Germany, expressed a need to move beyond what was perceived as obsolete in critical theory more than a need to draw on it in order to address contemporary problems. Horkheimer's work, in which the philosophical, sociological, and historical moments all outweighed the aesthetic, did not find a place in American discussions of literature and humanities and cultural studies, as had Adorno's and Benjamin's. By the late 1980s, Horkheimer had been eclipsed by Habermas in the reception of the Frankfurt School and American philosophy and sociology departments. Footnote: see, for example, Thomas McCarthy's translator's introduction to Jürgen Habermas's book, The Theory of Communicative Action, Volume 1, Reason and Rationalization of Society, published in 1984. Furthermore, as Russell Jacoby has pointed out in the article Das Verhalten der Frankfurter Schule in Keine kritische Theorie ohne Amerika, edited by Oskar Knecht, Detlef Clausen, and M. Wertz in 1999, the American reception of Habermas focused more on his strictly theoretical work rather than the political interventions that have made him such an important figure in the German public sphere. A noteworthy exception to this trend was Robert Holub's study, Jürgen Habermas, Critic in the Public Sphere, published in 1991, as well as the more recent study by Martin J. Matusik, Jürgen Habermas, a philosophical political profile, published in 2001. End footnote. Horkheimer's work, in which the philosophical, sociological, and historical moments all outweighed the aesthetic, did not find a place in American discussions of literature, humanities, and cultural studies, as had Adorno's and Benjamin's. In the 1980s, Horkheimer had also been eclipsed by Habermas in the reception of the Frankfurt School in American philosophy and sociology departments. By the 1990s, those scholars and intellectuals all still interested in critical theory had been split, for the most part, into three camps. Footnote: presenting the American reception of critical theory in this way is admittedly schematic and misleading in many ways, but it would go beyond my primary concern here, illustrating the general neglect of Horkheimer, to provide a more nuanced account. Thus, the three main tendencies in the American reception of critical theory in the 1980s and 1990s that I have named here are not intended as strict classifications, but simply as a preliminary means of orientation. For more detailed treatments of the American reception of critical theory in the 1980s and 1990s, which largely overlap with my account here, see Peter Hohendahl's book, Reappraisals, Shifting Alignments in Post-War Critical Theory, published in 1991. End footnote. There were those who believed Jürgen Habermas had overcome the weaknesses of the first generation of critical theory and reformulated it in terms adequate to the changing historical conditions. Habermas's principal works were translated into English in the 1980s, and his book, Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, was seen by many sympathetic to critical theory as a compelling critique of French post-structuralism. Footnote: to name only the most important, the book The Theory of Communicative Action, Volume 1, Reason and Rationalization of Society, and Volume 2, Life, World, and System, A Critique of Functionalist Reason, translated by Thomas McCarthy in 1984 and 1987, respectively, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, the book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, An Inquiry into a Category of Bourgeois Society, translated by Thomas Berger in 1989, and the book, Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, translated by Frederick G. Lawrence in 1987. End footnote. Footnote: members of the first group sympathetic to Habermas and generally hostile to post-structuralism include Thomas McCarthy, Andrew Arato, Gene Cohen, Salah Ben Habib, and Richard Wolin. End footnote. There were those who were less skeptical than Habermas about reconciling the tradition of critical theory and post-structuralism either on philosophical or aesthetic grounds. Finally, there were a few who were critical of both post-structuralism and Habermas's reformulation of critical theory. Let me repeat that. There were those who were less skeptical than Habermas about reconciling the traditions of critical theory and post-structuralism either on philosophical or aesthetic grounds. Footnote: members of this group include Martin J., Richard Bernstein, Nancy Fraser, Andreas Huyssen, Mark Poster, David Hoy, and Douglas Kellner. End footnote. Finally, there were a few who were critical of both post-structuralism and Habermas's reformulation of critical theory. Footnote: this group included some of the early members of the journal Telos. This group included some key members of the journal Telos, such as Paul Piccone and Russell Berman. The journal was sympathetic to Habermas in its early years, but turned increasingly to Adorno in the 1980s. See, for example, Robert Hullett Kenter's article, Back to Adorno, published in Telos 1989. Other participants in the discussion of critical theory in the United States who remained critical of both Habermas and French post-structuralism and sympathetic to Adorno and or Walter Benjamin include Peter Hohendahl, Susan Buck-Morss, Frederick Jameson, and J. Bernstein. End footnote. Common to all three general positions, however, was a surprising lack of reflection on the origins of critical theory in Horkheimer's early work and the relevance it might still have for contemporary discussions. Although Jürgen Habermas stressed the ongoing importance of Horkheimer's original program, his American followers made little effort to reassess that legacy themselves. Footnote: One important exception was the volume on Max Horkheimer, New Perspectives, edited by Salah Ben Habib, Wolfgang Bonz, and John McColl, published in 1993. This volume contains essays by some of the most important philosophers, sociologists, and intellectual historians working in the field of critical theory, yet the majority of the contributions were written by German scholars, which reflects the more profound reception of Horkheimer's critical theory in Germany. The, quote, emerging reevaluation of Horkheimer's work, and quote, of which the editors speak in their introduction, still has not arrived on the other side of the Atlantic. It is perhaps not surprising that this volume, despite the impressive intellectual stature of its contributors, seems to have left few traces in American discussions of critical theory. The editors frame Horkheimer's work largely in terms of a theoretical inspiration for Habermas, in his effort to move beyond the putative aporias of Adorno's mature work. Furthermore, many of the contributors represented in the volume make a strong case, either in their essays in the volume or elsewhere, that a reevaluation of Horkheimer's work is no longer necessary, that it no longer speaks to our present concerns. End footnote. They seem to assume that the task had already been accomplished with Habermas's reformulation of Horkheimer's early interdisciplinary project in terms of a theory of communicative action, the title of the book. Footnote. This is reflected, for example, in the introduction to On Max Horkheimer, New Perspectives, as mentioned in the previous footnote. End footnote. Those who sought some sort of reconciliation between post-structuralism and critical theory look to the work of Walter Benjamin and to a lesser degree Theodor Adorno, often stressing their critiques of totalizing reason and their work on aesthetics and cultural theory. Those who remain steadfastly critical of both Habermas and post-structuralism called for a renewed assessment not of Horkheimer, but of Adorno's work, which they viewed as the most sophisticated formulation of critical theory and more relevant to present concerns. Footnote. Indeed, for some, such as Frederick Jameson, the importance and relevance of Adorno's work did not become fully apparent until the 1990s. See Frederick Jameson's book, Late Marxism, Adorno or the Persistence of the Dialectic, published in 1990. End footnote. Horkheimer had, in other words, been largely forgotten across the entire spectrum of discussions about critical theory in the United States. In the past decade, the reception of critical theory has expanded and diversified in ways that are too complex to recount here. One can say, however, that interest in Benjamin, Adorno, and Habermas has remained strong, while Horkheimer's work has continued to be neglected. New section, the relevance of Horkheimer's early critical theory to contemporary discussions. Horkheimer's early critical theory could contribute to contemporary discussions in a number of different fields. First, Horkheimer's early work provides an excellent model for a materialist intellectual history of modern Europe. At first glance, quote, materialist intellectual history, and quote, may appear to be a contradictio in adjecto, but revisiting Horkheimer's early lectures and essays makes clear why this is not the case. Horkheimer's concept of materialism is thoroughly historical, not ontological, metaphysical, mechanical, or physiological. Horkheimer explicitly criticized attempts by Lenin and others to define materialism as the ahistorical primacy of, quote, matter over, quote, mind. Surveying and bringing up to date the long history of philosophical materialism, Horkheimer argues that this anti-traditional tradition has manifested itself most consistently in a critique of ideas that justify socially and historically constructed forms of domination as eternal or necessary. Philosophical materialism has consistently deflated pretensions to, quote, absolute truth, and, quote, and allied itself with concrete political and social movements in the name of the more, quote, modest goal of improving the lives of concrete individuals living under historically specific forms of social domination. Yet materialism for Horkheimer, as for Marx, also constitutes a method of interpreting history and intellectual history. It expresses the conviction that even the most recondite ideas have a specific social content that binds them in more or less mediated ways to the struggles of concrete individuals and groups, which reproduce or alter historically specific social conditions and institutions. Taken together, Horkheimer's lectures from the late 1920s and his essays from the 1930s provide a remarkably rich materialist interpretation of the intellectual history of modern European philosophy. From the Renaissance all the way through to early 20th century tendencies such as phenomenology and vitalism. Horkheimer consistently provides penetrating and original interpretations of the philosophical movements, authors and works he examines, while at the same time demonstrating how their ideas are a mediated expression of the larger dialectic of bourgeois society that characterizes the history of modern Europe. One important example of how Horkheimer's early work could contribute to contemporary discussions in intellectual history is his distinctive interpretation of the Enlightenment, which identifies the critical and sensualist currents of the French Enlightenment as paradigmatic for the movement as a whole, and rejects the tired yet remarkably stubborn romantic myth that the Enlightenment was the apotheosis of abstract reason. Footnote: Horkheimer would certainly have agreed with Peter Gay's argument that, quote, the philosophs' glorification of criticism and their qualified repudiation of metaphysics make it obvious that the Enlightenment was not an age of reason, but a revolt against rationalism. End quote. See Peter Gay's The Enlightenment and Interpretation, Volume 1, The Rise of Modern Paganism, published in 1966, end footnote. The historically specific and socially grounded interpretation of the Enlightenment found in Horkheimer's early work provides a corrective not only to recent Heideggerian and post-structuralist-inspired interpretations, which tend to see the critical, emancipatory, and anti-authoritarian tendencies of the Enlightenment philosophy as a mere facade concealing a deeper, unacknowledged drive for, quote, truth and, quote, power, but also to the more pessimistic interpretation of Horkheimer and Adorno themselves, put forth in the 1940s, which viewed the historical Enlightenment primarily as an episode in a much larger process of the progressive domination of internal and external nature by instrumental reason. Second, one finds in Horkheimer's and Erich Fromm's early critical theory a model of historical social psychology that has been neglected, but which could still serve as an an important point of reference in the much larger ongoing discussion of the transformation of character structures, sensibilities, and everyday life in early modern Europe. In essays such as Beginnings of the Bourgeois Philosophy of History, the essay Egoism and Freedom Movements, and the essay Montaigne and the Function of Skepticism, Horkheimer articulates a distinctive interpretation not only of the intellectual but also the social and social-psychological transformations of Europe during the dawn of the, quote, bourgeois epoch. Horkheimer's essays could be read profitably alongside older and newer, quote, classical accounts of the transformation of sensibilities in everyday life in early modern Europe, such as Max Weber's book Protestant Ethic, Norbert Elias's book The Civilizing Process, and Michel Foucault's book Madness and Civilization. Furthermore, in a number of essays in the early 1930s, Horkheimer and Fromm present an innovative theoretical synthesis of historical materialism and psychoanalysis which guided their interpretations of early modern Europe and which could still provide historians with insights today. Whereas much more recent historical scholarship on the transformation of sensibilities in everyday life at the dawn of the modern era has been influenced by Foucault's model of, quote, discipline, Horkheimer and Fromm's alternative theoretical approach could provide new insights into many of the same problems. Footnote: for example, John Balsi's book Christianity in Europe, 1400 to 1700, published in 1985, and Philip Gorsky's more recent book, The Disciplinary Revolution, Calvinism and the Rise of the State in Early Modern Europe, published in 2003, both rely heavily, implicitly in Balsi's case and explicitly in Gorsky's case, on Foucault. Both draw on Foucault's insights and concepts to make a convincing case for the necessity of paying close attention to religion and its transformation in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in order to grasp the parallel transformation of character structures and patterns of everyday life in early modern Europe. With Foucault and against Elias, both authors want to take our attention away from the centralized state and to argue that the transformation of character, structures, sensibilities, and everyday practices among the middle and lower classes was every bit as dramatic and had equally far-reaching historical consequences. Horkheimer and Fromm's analyses also focus on the emergence of qualitatively new character structures among the middle and lower classes in early modern Europe. In contrast to Foucault, however, Horkheimer and Fromm are able to move beyond a merely descriptive account, which eschews causal explanations. To be sure, Marx's account of the rise of modern capitalism provides their primary explanatory model. Yet Horkheimer and Fromm's rejection of a reductionist economism Their insistence on the, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, of psychological structures and culture lead to questions and conclusions very similar to those of Balsi and Gorski. End footnote. In contrast to Foucault and the majority of historians who have remained suspicious of psychoanalysis, some leading historians have been arguing for some time that the profession could benefit from a serious engagement with Freud's work. Footnote. See, for example, H. Stuart Hughes' article, History and Psychoanalysis, The Explanation of a Motive, in the book History is Art and Science, published in 1975, and Peter Gay's book, Freud for Historians, published in 1985. End footnote. Horkheimer's early essays provide one sophisticated model for how such an engagement could productively take place. Third, revisiting Horkheimer's and Fromm's early work is also crucial to recovering the historical and theoretical foundations of the Institute's later analyses of prejudice. In the 1940s, the Institute sponsored the 5-volume Studies in Prejudice, of which Horkheimer served as the general editor. Of the 5 volumes, the 2 co-authored by members of the Institute, Prophets of Deceit by Leo Löwenthal and The Authoritarian Personality by Theodor Adorno, built theoretically in Horkheimer's and Fromm's analyses in the 1930s of the anthropology of the bourgeois epoch. However, as Thomas Wheatland has recently shown, the theoretical principles that had guided the Institute's original formulation of the project disappeared into the background as the Institute was forced to adapt to the standards of mainstream American empirical social research and to the expectations of the American Jewish Committee, which generously funded the project. Although these principles played a crucial role in the execution of the volumes co-authored by Löwenthal and Adorno, even here the empirical data and psychological explanations were foregrounded in a manner that rendered the underlying social and historical dimensions of the Institute's theory of prejudice practically invisible. Footnote. See Paul Masing's contribution to the book Studies in Prejudice, Rehearsal for Destruction, could be seen as the exception. Paul Masing's contribution to the Studies in Prejudice, Rehearsal for Destruction, could be seen as the exception here, insofar as it was an explicitly historical study of anti-Semitism in Wilhelmine, Germany, but Paul Masing paid little attention to psychological factors. Paul Masing did not begin to work with the Institute until 1942, and his study is not indebted to its theoretical principles in any way that the volumes co-authored by Löwenthal and Adorno were. End footnote. Recovering these foundations of the critical theorist analyses of prejudice could provide new insights into the dominant forms of prejudice that exist in modern capitalist societies and the specific social constellations, such as fascism and conservative populism, in which these forms find their most virulent expression. Such a reconsideration would reveal striking parallels between older and more recent work on the history of prejudice in the United States. Footnote. Interesting parallels to the Institute's theory and studies of prejudice could be found, to name just 2 examples, in Richard Hofstadter's analyses of conservative populism or David Rudiger's more recent analysis of working-class racism in the early 19th century. In his analyses, Hofstadter drew explicitly on Adorno's concept of, quote, pseudo-conservatism, end quote, which in turn relied heavily on Horkheimer's earlier work. See his Paranoid Style in American Politics and Other Essays, published in 2008. Like the book The Authoritarian Personality, Hofstadter's analysis of the, quote, paranoid style, end quote, in politics suffers from an over-reliance on psychological methods of explanation, but his analysis in the book The Age of Reform, published in 1955, of the historical origins of pseudo-conservatism in the United States demonstrates many parallels with Horkheimer's analysis of bourgeois anthropology. Similarly, David Rudiger's analysis of, quote, Herren folk republicanism, end quote, that developed among the white working class in the United States in the 19th century bears a striking resemblance to Horkheimer and Fromm's analysis of the sadomasochistic character in the 1930s. End footnote. Fourth, Horkheimer's early critical theory could help reestablish a truly interdisciplinary approach to critical theory. The sketch above, the Anglo-American reception of critical theory, demonstrates just how uneven this reception has been. Whereas scholars in the humanities deserve much credit for preserving and extending the rich cultural and aesthetic theories of Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno, and scholars in philosophy and political theory also deserve credit for doing the same for the work of Jürgen Habermas, Anglo-American sociologists and historians have demonstrated less interest in critical theory. Revisiting Horkheimer's early work would reveal a model of critical theory that would appeal much more to critical, theoretically minded historians and sociologists. Furthermore, the early Horkheimer's stress on interdisciplinary collaboration and his openness to incorporating new methods and research from other fields could also provide an important theoretical model for contemporary research in the humanities and social sciences, which has increasingly blurred the boundaries between these disciplines in recent years. Finally, revisiting his work could help move beyond the limitations of the, quote, linguistic and or, quote, cultural turn, which have become the subject of much discussion in the past 2 decades. During the heated philosophical debates that occurred in the 1980s and 1990s between Habermas and the post-structuralists and their respective adherents, it was often forgotten that both camps presupposed a, quote, linguistic turn of one sort or another. Although the main point of reference for Habermas's linguistic turn were not structural linguistics or anthropology, as was the case in France, but rather in the philosophical traditions of hermeneutics, phenomenology, and pragmatism. He too viewed the linguistic turn as a necessary condition of, quote, post-metaphysical, end quote, philosophy in the late 20th century, including analytic philosophy. Footnote, see for example the article Hermeneutische und Analytische Philosophie, zwei komplementäre Spielarten der linguistischen Wende, in Jürgen Habermas's book Wahrheit and Rechtfertigung, Philosophische Aufsätze, published in 1999 in Germany. As the title of the essay suggests, Habermas makes a case for considering the hermeneutic and, quote, formal pragmatic, end quote, traditions, which were so crucial for his own theory and analytic philosophy, as 2 complementary versions of the linguistic turn. Thus, in his view, the linguistic turn also reaches beyond structuralism and post-structuralism to encompass the dominant philosophical school in the Anglo-American world in the 20th century, analytic philosophy. End footnote. Despite path-breaking work in a variety of areas, an unmistakable disenchantment with or recognition of the limitations of the linguistic turn had become apparent by the end of the 90s. At the latest, even Habermas himself reintroduced a concept of, quote, weak naturalism, end quote, in order to diffuse the dangers of, quote, linguistic idealism Habermas diagnosed in his own earlier work, and he reconsidered the merits of, quote, mindfulness of nature in the subject, end quote, with respect to debates about stem cell research and genetic modification of human embryos. Footnote. The phrase, quote, mindfulness of nature in the subject, end quote, comes from Horkheimer and Adorno from Dialectic of Enlightenment, but could well be used to characterize one important aspect of Habermas's arguments in the book The Future of Human Nature, translated by Hella Beister in 2003, anxious to distance himself from what he considered the utopian implication of arguments against the domination of nature in critical theory. Habermas had, until his most recent work, always maintained that humans could interact with nature only in a purely instrumental way. The debate on stem cell research and genetic modification seems to have convinced Habermas that this argument has its limits in relation to human nature. For Habermas defends a concept of species ethics. The allusions to the young Marx, his Feuerbachian arguments about species being is unmistakable, which defend a notion of common human nature as a necessary condition for any further moral reflection. To be sure, species ethics are only the first step in a larger argument that rests primarily on the extension of Habermas's discourse ethics to the unborn fetus, as a potential participant in an ideal speech situation. The concept does nonetheless represent an important shift vis-a-vis his earlier positions. End footnote. Yet Habermas continues to defend the linguistic turn as the best, indeed the only possible path beyond the dead end of, quote, consciousness philosophy, end quote, in which the main currents of Western philosophy had culminated in the early 20th century. Although Habermas argues that Horkheimer's critical theory failed to recognize the necessity of taking a linguistic turn and remained beholden to an anachronistic paradigm of, quote, consciousness philosophy, end quote, my study attempts to demonstrate why that is not the case. On the contrary, Horkheimer's early critical theory offers an alternative path beyond not only consciousness philosophy, but also the limitations of the linguistic turn. More recently, William Sewell, who was one of the pioneers of the, quote, linguistic and cultural turn, end quote, in the discipline of history in the 1970s, has also pointed to its limitations and has made a case for a return to a new form of social history, which preserves the best insights of the linguistic and cultural turn, while at the same time reintroducing a theory of modern capitalism that can do justice to macro-causal factors. Footnote, see William Sewell Jr.'s book, Logics of History, Social Theory, and Social Transformation, published in 2005. End footnote. Horkheimer's early critical theory provides just as much a model insofar as it rests on a Marxist theory of modern society as capitalist, while at the same time moving beyond economistic determinism and recognizing the, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, of culture and physics structures. Footnote, see for example Horkheimer's contribution to the introduction of the Institute's studies on authority and family, the article Authority of Family, in Max Horkheimer's book Critical Theory, or the book that's, I guess, a collection of his essays. End footnote. Although Horkheimer's early critical theory does have the potential to contribute to contemporary discussions in the ways just mentioned and others, there are not surprisingly many ways in which it would need to be supplemented and or updated in light of more recent historical developments. To mention only what is perhaps the most important of these ways, Horkheimer's early critical theory suffered from a liberal democratic political deficit, which was already apparent in his lectures on the history of philosophy in the late 1920s, which persisted through the 1930s, and which became even more apparent after his adoption of the, quote, state capitalism thesis, end quote, the, quote, state capitalism, end quote, thesis around 1940. One manifestation of this deficit can be found, as I argue in Chapter 4, in Horkheimer's interpretation of certain key Enlightenment philosophers. In his lectures and writings from the late 1920s and early 1930s, Horkheimer found much more to admire in the historical Enlightenment in general and the French Enlightenment in particular than he and Adorno would in Dialectic of Enlightenment. Yet, unlike his Institute colleague Franz Neumann, Horkheimer was not willing to apply this interpretation of the Enlightenment to those political philosophers of the Enlightenment who articulated liberal democratic political ideals. Whereas Neumann recognized that Marx's theory needed to recover and reintegrate the best aspects of the liberal democratic political tradition and highlighted the ways in which Montesquieu and Rousseau's political ideals anticipated and were compatible with Marx's vision of socialism. Horkheimer's negation of this tradition and these ideals was abstract rather than determinate. This deficit in Horkheimer's thought became more apparent after 1940 when he expressed extreme skepticism about the historical substance and staying power of the liberal democratic political traditions in the West, arguing that the Western powers would be more likely to collaborate with fascism or to become fascist themselves than actively combat fascism. Nonetheless, Horkheimer's overall interpretation of the Enlightenment in his early work leaves open the possibility of a reconsideration of the liberal democratic political tradition in a way that Dialectic of Enlightenment does not. So despite this deficit, Horkheimer's arguments about the emancipatory philosophical ideals of the ascendant bourgeoisie could be extended to liberal democratic politics in a way that he himself did not do at the time. After 1950, Horkheimer began defending the liberal democratic political traditions of the West in a manner that was often as one-sided as his earlier critique of those traditions had been. A critical theory adequate to present conditions must avoid either extreme. It would need to preserve those aspects of Marx's critique of modern capitalism that are still relevant, while at the same time preserving the best aspects of the liberal democratic political tradition, such as individual rights, the rule of law, and the division of powers, that would make it impossible to repeat the catastrophic experiences in the 20th century of so-called real existing socialism. Yet 21st century critical theory must refuse the complacent claims that liberal democratic political institutions represent the end of history, and must also continue to identify and help combat the ways in which social domination reproduces itself within the societies with liberal democratic political institutions. New section, overview of the book's structure and content. Let us now take a look at the structure of the book as a whole, which is divided into 4 main sections. Chapters 1 and 2 comprise the first section. They examine Horkheimer's childhood and youth, which were spent mainly in Zuffenhausen, a suburb of Stuttgart, Germany, and his student years in Frankfurt. The first chapter focuses on Horkheimer's early friendship with Friedrich Pollock, his relationships with his parents and his future wife, Rosa Rieker, his reaction to and involvement in World War I, and his brief participation in a Bohemian circle in Munich that was frequented by several artists and revolutionaries who would play a prominent role in the abortive Council Republic there in 1919. The first chapter also presents and analyzes a series of short plays and novellas that Horkheimer wrote during this time, which provide important insights into his early intellectual development. The second chapter turns to Horkheimer's studies at the J.W. Goethe University in Frankfurt, where he completed his doctorate and his habilitation in philosophy in 1923 and 1925, respectively. During this time, Horkheimer met Felix Weil, with whom he and Friedrich Pollock would hatch the plans for the Institute for Social Research, and Hans Cornelius, who would become not only Horkheimer's most important academic mentor, but also a close personal friend. Horkheimer wrote his PhD and habilitation schrift, which both focused on Kant's critique of judgment under Cornelius's direction. As I argue in Chapter 2, these early academic writings testify more to Horkheimer's loyalty to Cornelius at this time than to his own nascent critical theory. In the second section of the book, which consists of Chapters 3, 4, and 5, I analyze how Horkheimer's early critical theory took shape during the period 1925 to 1931. I argue in particular that Horkheimer's break with Cornelius in 1925 is at the same time a break with consciousness philosophy as a whole, a break which proceeded along with 2 interrelated yet distinct axes: a diachronic historical axis and a synchronic social axis. Footnote: my argument here is intended as a critique of Jürgen Habermas's influential interpretation of Horkheimer and Adorno, which maintains that their work remained trapped with the paradigm of consciousness philosophy. Footnote: see Jürgen Habermas's book Theory of Communicative Action, Volume 1, translated in 1984, and footnote. And footnote. Where am I? In Chapter 3, I examine Horkheimer's materialist interpretation of the history of modern European philosophy, which leaves no doubt that he did not view consciousness as the absolute beginning point of philosophy. Instead, Horkheimer interpreted modern European philosophy in the mediated expression of the uneven development of bourgeois society. In Chapters 4 and 5, I turn my attention to the origins and development of Horkheimer's theory of contemporary society. The former chapter focuses primarily on Horkheimer's critical appropriation of Marx's theory, which I reconstruct through an examination of his critique of Lenin's book Materialism and Imperial Criticism and Karl Mannheim's book Ideology and Utopia, and through an analysis of the collection of aphorisms Horkheimer wrote between 1926 and 1931, which were published pseudonymously in 1934 as Dämmerung. Footnote: an incomplete and unsatisfactory English translation of Demerong has been published, which also includes notes Horkheimer wrote much later in his life. See the book Dawn and Decline, notes 1926 to 1931 and 1950 to 1969, translated by Michael Shaw, published in 1978. End footnote. Chapter 5 examines Horkheimer's integration of psychoanalysis into his critical theory of contemporary society, and the important contributions made to this process by his friend and analyst, Karl Landauer, and by his future Institute colleague, Erich Fromm. Here again in chapters 4 and 5, it is apparent that Horkheimer sees consciousness as both already mediated by society, not as an absolute point of departure. In both chapters, we see Horkheimer stress, for example, the ways in which consciousness is shaped by unconscious character structures, and in turn are shaped by historically specific social conditions. In the third section of the book, which is comprised by chapters 6, 7, and 8, I turn to the, quote, mature formulation of Horkheimer's early critical theory in the period 1931 to 37. In terms of the development of Horkheimer's critical theory, the continuities between the periods before and after his assumption of the directorship of the Institute for Social Research in January 1931 are more important than the differences. In contrast to studies of Horkheimer's work that begin in 1931, the second section of the study is intended to demonstrate how Horkheimer's early critical theory took shape already in the late 1920s. His basic theoretical assumptions were already in place when Horkheimer became director, but he now had an opportunity to put these ideas to work within an institutional setting, to test, develop, and refine them. The 1930s were Horkheimer's most productive period theoretically, and, in the opinion of the author and others, the period in which he produced his highest quality work. The plethora of philosophically dense, theoretically nuanced, and historically self-reflexive essays Horkheimer wrote during this time defy synopsis. Yet a careful examination of his work does reveal four concepts that are the most crucial for the development of his thought in the 1930s: materialism, the anthropology of the bourgeois epoch, dialectical logic, and state capitalism. Chapters 6, 7, and 8 examine how the first three of these concepts, and with them Horkheimer's critical theory as a whole unfold in the 1930s. Chapter 6 focuses in particular on the essays Materialism and Metaphysics and Materialism and Morality, in which Horkheimer presents a highly suggestive, anti-foundational concept of materialism. Horkheimer engages deeply with the tradition of philosophical materialism while at the same time insisting on a determination of the concept adequate to the 20th century social, historical, and intellectual conditions. Chapter 7 focuses on his attempt to develop a historically and psychologically informed theory of the character structure that became dominant in modern capitalist societies, that of bourgeois man. The chapter begins with Horkheimer's methodological reflections on this problem in essays such as, quote, History and Psychology, end quote, and, quote, Remarks on Philosophical Anthropology, end quote. Continues with his attempt to flesh it out historically in the article Egoism and Freedom Movements on the Anthropology of the Bourgeois Epoch, and concludes with an examination of the Institute's collective empirical project, the book The Studies on Authority and Family, which is interpreted as an attempt to apply and test Horkheimer's concept of bourgeois anthropology to contemporary societies. In Chapter 7, considerable attention is also paid to Erich Fromm's contributions to Horkheimer's conceptualization of the, quote, anthropology of the bourgeois epoch, end quote. Horkheimer considers all of the essays he wrote in the 1930s as preliminary studies for a larger, more comprehensive project on the, quote, logic of the social sciences, end quote, or simply, quote, dialectical logic, end quote, as he put it. Eventually, some aspects of this project would be realized in the book Dialectic of Enlightenment. However, Chapter 8 is intended to demonstrate that Horkheimer's dialectical logic had a very different form in the mid and late 1930s than it would later assume after he began working more closely with Adorno. The contours of the project at that time, which is very much worth reconsidering today, emerged through an examination of the essays titled On the Rationality Debate in Contemporary Philosophy and on the problem of thought, on the problem of truth, And the essay article's latest attack on metaphysics, and the article, The Latest Attack on Metaphysics, and the article, Traditional and Critical Theory, which is on this channel. The fourth and final section of the book examines the causes and theoretical end of the 1930s and the beginning of the 1940s. Put schematically, one could say that this major shift in Horkheimer's thought had three main causes: his theoretical split with Erich Fromm, his closer working relationship with Theodor Adorno, and his adoption of a modified version of Friedrich Pollock's state capitalism thesis. Chapter 9 continues the methodological approach of the previous section insofar as it uses the concept of, quote, state capitalism to demonstrate the changes that occurred in Horkheimer's thought between 1938 and 1941. It focuses in particular on the essays Montaigne and the Function of Skepticism, The Jews and Europe, and The Authoritarian State, and the article The End of Reason. Chapter 9 is preceded by two excursuses dedicated to Horkheimer's changing relationship at this time with Fromm and Adorno. The first shorter excursus draws primarily on a lengthy unpublished text Fromm wrote in the fall and winter of 1936 to 37, which sheds new light on the theoretical foundations of his split with Horkheimer and the Institute as a whole. The second lengthier excursus examines the development of Horkheimer's theoretical relationship with Theodor Adorno in the 1930s. As mentioned, one consequence of Horkheimer's Eclipse and the Anglo-American reception of critical theory has been a tendency to use Horkheimer primarily as the co-author of the book Dialectic of Enlightenment, and to overlook the fact that the development of Horkheimer's and Adorno's critical theories followed very different trajectories. Whereas the second and third sections of this study reconstruct the development of Horkheimer's early critical theory, this excursus provides an overview of Adorno's trajectory in the late 1920s and 1930s, both an emphasis on the ways in which his thought diverged from Horkheimer's. Although Adorno did move closer to some of Horkheimer's positions in the late 1930s, it was ultimately Horkheimer's abandonment of some of the basic assumptions that had guided his early critical theory that set the stage for their collaboration on the book Dialectic of Enlightenment. However, as I argue in the epilogue, some of the basic theoretical assumptions that guided Dialectic of Enlightenment appear dated and or problematic from our perspective today. I would like to suggest that Horkheimer's early critical theory would serve as a more promising point of departure for a renewal of critical theory today than the book Dialectic of Enlightenment. Okay, and that is the end of the introduction to Max Horkheimer and the Foundations of the Frankfurt School by John Abromeit. Thank you so much for listening.